The storm had been brutal. It came without warning on a Tuesday night, tearing through the mountains of Valdris, gnawing like a giant fist. Trees fell. Power lines snapped. Rain came down so hard that it turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. For most people in the small colony town of Cedar Falls, it was the worst storm they had seen in years. But for Frank Cole, it was just another reason to get up early and get to work. Frank was 54 years old. He was not a tall man, but he was broad and strong, in the way that only someone who had spent decades working with his hands could be. His hair was gray now, and his face had lines carved deep by years of sun and wind. He had served 12 years in the military before he left and became a master electrician. Now he lived alone in a small wooden cabin on the edge of town, near the base of the old mountains. He liked it quiet. He liked it simple. And he liked being left alone. That morning he grabbed his tool belt, pulled on his boots, and headed out. The air was cold and wet. Puddles had formed everywhere, branches were down all over the road, and he had to step over them every few steps. The power lines that ran along the old path up the mountain were in bad shape. Some of them had snapped clean off their poles. Others hung low and dangerous, sparking in the damp air. It was Frank's job to fix them. It was always Frank's job. He worked quietly and without complaint. He had done this kind of work 1,000 times before. Climb the pole. Check the line. Move on. The clouds were still thick and gray above him, and the wind blew in short, cold bursts that cut through his jacket. But Frank did not mind. He was used to hard conditions. The military had taught him that. It was sometime after noon when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, a high, thin sound like something crying far away. He stopped and listened. The sound came again. It was not the wind. It was coming from somewhere below him, down in the rocky ravine that ran along the base of the mountain. Frank set down his tools and walked to the edge. He looked down into the ravine, squinting through the mist and the leftover rain. He saw them. 2 small creatures were huddled together on a flat rock halfway down the slope. They were small, about the size of large dogs, and they were shaking. Their bodies were covered in thin, shiny scales. One had dark red scales that seemed to glow faintly even in the gray light. The other was darker, almost black, with flickers of orange along its wings. Wings. They had wings. Small, folded, and pressed tight against their backs, but wings all the same. Dragon cubs. Frank had heard stories about dragons on Valdris. 9. Everyone had. They lived deep in the mountains, far from the colony towns. People did not bother them, and the dragons did not bother people. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. But no one in Cedar Falls had ever seen one up close. Not like this. The cubs were crying. The sound was soft and broken, like they had been crying for a long time and were too tired to cry any louder. One of them had a cut along its side, and the other kept stumbling every time it tried to move, its small legs shaking under its weight. They were hurt. They were alone. And they were scared. Frank stood at the edge of the ravine for a long moment. He knew he should not go down there. Dragons were wild creatures. They belonged to the Empire, to the Dragon Empire that ruled a large stretch of the galaxy. Taking a dragon, even a hurt one, even a baby, could bring serious trouble. He knew this. Every person in the colony knew this. But Frank Cole had never been the kind of man who walked away from something that needed help. He climbed down the ravine carefully, picking his way over the wet rocks. The mud was slippery, and he moved slowly so he would not fall. As he got closer, the cubs noticed him. They looked up with wide, bright eyes. One pair gold, the other a deep amber color. For a moment they froze. Frank stopped too. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He just stood there, calm and still, the way he had learned to do a long time ago, in a place much harder than this mountain. After a few seconds, the cubs did not run, they did not hiss or growl, they just looked at him, trembling and small. Frank knelt down slowly. He opened his tool bag and pulled out a clean cloth. He moved closer, one step at a time. The dark red cub watched him with its gold eyes, but did not pull away. Frank reached out his hand, palm open, fingers flat. The cub sniffed his hand once, then it pressed its small head into his palm. Something shifted in Frank's chest. He did not know what it was, but he felt it. He worked quietly after that. He cleaned the cut on the first cub as gently as he could, using water from his canteen and the clean cloth. The wound was not deep, but it had bled enough to cause pain. The second cub had a bruised leg, probably from a fall during the storm. Frank wrapped it carefully with a strip of fabric, the same way he had learned to treat injuries during his years in the military. It took him almost an hour to carry them up the ravine. He made 2 trips. He placed each cub gently into his tool bag, one at a time, and climbed back up the slippery rocks with slow, careful steps. By the time he reached the top, his arms were tired and his jacket was soaked through. But the cubs were safe. The walk back to his cabin took longer than usual. The road was a mess, and Frank moved carefully so he would not stumble while carrying the two small creatures. They had stopped crying now. The dark red one sat quietly against his chest, its small body warm. The black one peeked out from under his arm, looking at the world around it with wide, curious eyes. When Frank finally reached his cabin, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The place was small and simple. A single room with a bed, a table, a wood stove, and not much else. He set the cubs down gently on a blanket near the stove and added some wood to the fire. Warmth filled the room slowly. He looked at them for a long time. Two small dragons sitting on his blanket looking up at him. Frank did not know what was going to happen next. He did not know what the Empire would say when they found out. He did not know if he had just made the best decision of his life or the worst. But he knew one thing. He was not going to let them go. He sat down in the chair beside the stove, and the two cubs moved closer to him, pressing against his legs. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, and thin beams of light fell through the cabin window. Frank Cole looked at the two small creatures at his feet and said nothing at all. He simply stayed. The first few days were the hardest. Frank Cole had no idea how to take care of dragon cubs. He did not know what they ate. He did not know how much sleep they needed. He did not know if the blanket near the stove was warm enough or if the small pieces of meat he set out for them were the right kind. He simply guessed, and he watched, and he tried again when something did not work. The dark red cub, the one with gold eyes, was the bolder of the two. It moved around the cabin with curious steps, sniffing at everything it could find. It bumped into the legs of the table. It pawed at Frank's boots. It sat near the fire and watched the flames with wide, bright eyes, as if it had never seen anything so interesting. Frank began to call this One Ember. The name came to him on the second night, when the cub curled up near the wood stove and its red scales caught the light of the fire. It looked like a small piece of flame. The other cub was quieter. It stayed close to Ember at all times, and it watched Frank from a distance for the first 2 days before it allowed him to come near. Its scales were dark, almost black, with small flickers of orange that showed up when the light hit them in just the right way. Frank called this One Cinder. It suited the little creature. Cinder was shy, but once it trusted you, it stayed close and did not let go easily. By the end of the first week, both cubs had begun to eat well. Frank found that they liked raw fish the most. He caught them from the small stream that ran behind his cabin every morning. He also found that they liked warmth. They slept near the stove almost every night, pressed together, their small bodies rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Sometimes when Frank sat in his chair and read, one of them would get up and come to rest its head on his foot. He did not move. He just let it stay. It was on the 9th day that Frank made his first mistake. He had gone into town to buy supplies. Cedar Falls was a small place. A few shops, a general store, a small clinic, and not much else. He bought what he needed and left. But when he got home and opened the door, both cubs rushed toward him the moment he stepped inside. Ember jumped up, its small claws scratching at his jacket. Cinder pressed against his leg and made a soft, low sound, almost like a purr. Frank smiled. He did not smile often, but he smiled then. The problem was that he had left the window open. Linda Marsh lived in the next cabin over, about 100 yards away. She was 49 years old, with sharp brown eyes and steady hands. She had been a veterinarian for almost 20 years, and there was almost nothing she did not know about animals. She was also one of the few people in Cedar Falls that Frank actually liked. She was quiet. She did not ask too many questions. And she was not the kind of person who talked to others about things that were not her business. But Linda was also not blind. She had seen the cubs through the window. She had watched Ember jump up at Frank's jacket. She had seen Cinder press against his leg. She had stood in her own doorway for a full minute, her mouth slightly open, staring. The next morning, she knocked on Frank's door. Frank opened it and found Linda standing on his porch with her arms crossed and her eyebrows raised. She did not say hello. She did not say good morning. She simply looked past him, into the cabin, where Ember and Cinder were sitting near the stove, watching the stranger at the door with bright, curious eyes. Linda looked back at Frank. He knew there was no point in lying. He stepped aside and let her in. Linda spent the next 2 hours examining the cubs. She checked their wounds, looked at their scales, watched the way they moved, and tested their reactions to different sounds and touches. She did not rush. She took her time, and she was gentle. Ember did not mind her at all. Cinder was more cautious, but after a while, it allowed Linda to run her hands along its side without pulling away. When she was done, she sat down at Frank's table and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said one thing. "They trust you." Frank nodded. He did not add anything to that. Linda was quiet for another moment. Then she said she would help. She did not ask why Frank had kept them. She did not lecture him about the risks. She simply said she would help, and that was that. She came back the next day with some medical supplies and a few ideas about what to feed them to keep them healthy. She visited every 2 or 3 days after that, always in the early morning, always quietly. The cubs grew fast. Faster than Frank expected. Within 2 weeks, they were noticeably bigger. Their wings had started to unfold a little when they stretched, and their legs were stronger now. They could run, short, clumsy bursts across the cabin floor that made the whole place shake slightly. Ember had begun to make small sounds that were almost like laughter when it played. Cinder had started to follow Frank everywhere he went, even to the outhouse, even to the woodpile. It never let him get more than a few steps away. Frank began to realize something that surprised him. These cubs were not just animals, they were smart, very smart. Ember learned to open the door latch after watching Frank do it only 3 times. Cinder figured out that if it sat near Frank's chair and made a soft sound, Frank would reach down and stroke its head. They watched each other and copied what they saw. They communicated with small sounds and looks in ways that Frank could not fully understand, but he could feel the meaning behind them. They were thinking. They were learning. And they were bonding with him in a way that went far beyond what any normal animal would do. It was Gary Owens who found out next. Gary was 38 years old. He was the local sheriff deputy in Cedar Falls, not the sheriff himself, but the man who did most of the actual work. He was easygoing by nature. He laughed often, wore his hat slightly crooked, and never seemed to be in a hurry about anything. Most people in town liked him. He was fair, and he was not the kind of deputy who went looking for trouble where there was none. But Gary was also doing his rounds one evening when he saw Ember sitting on the porch of Frank's cabin. He stopped his vehicle and stared for a full 10 seconds. Then he got out, walked up to the porch, and stood there with his hands on his hips. Ember looked up at him and made a small chirping sound as if it was greeting him. Gary looked at the cub. Then he looked at the cabin door. Then he looked back at the cub. "Well," he said quietly, "that is something." Frank came out a minute later and found Gary standing on his porch staring at Ember like a man who had just seen something he could not explain. The 2 men looked at each other. Frank did not try to explain. Gary did not ask him to. Instead, Gary sat down on the porch steps, and Ember crawled into his lap without any fear at all. Gary stayed for almost an hour that evening. He met Cinder too, and he watched the way both cubs acted around Frank. Calm, trusting, attached. He watched the way Frank moved around them, careful and quiet, like a man who had found something precious and did not want to break it.
Before he left, Gary looked at Frank and said something simple. "I am not going to report this."
"Not yet. But Frank, you know this cannot stay hidden forever." Frank nodded. He knew that too. But for now, the secret held. The 3 of them, Frank, Linda, and Gary, kept it between them. The cubs grew a little bigger each day, and every night, when the cabin was quiet and the fire was burning low, Ember and Cinder curled up beside Frank Cole, and the old electrician sat in his chair and watched them sleep. He still did not know what was coming, but he knew that, whatever it was, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else in his life. Quietly, calmly, and without backing down. The Dragon Empire was old. Older than most civilizations in the galaxy could remember. It had existed for thousands of years, long before humans had ever left their own world and traveled among the stars. The dragons who ruled it were not like the dragons in old human stories. They were not mindless beasts. They were intelligent. They spoke. They built. They governed. And they were proud. Proud of their history, proud of their kind, and proud of the empire that their ancestors had built from nothing into one of the most powerful forces in the known galaxy. Emperor Kalen sat at the center of all of it. He was ancient, older than any human could fully understand. His scales were a deep, dark gold, and his eyes were the color of cold fire. He was not a cruel ruler. He did not enjoy causing pain or fear, but he was firm. He believed in order. He believed in the laws of his empire, and he believed that his people deserved to be protected, especially the young ones. When the news came that 2 cubs had gone missing, the emperor did not react with anger. He reacted with something quieter and in many ways more dangerous. He reacted with focus. The cubs had disappeared during the great storm that had swept through the border regions of Valdris. 9. The storm had been unusually violent, strong enough to scatter even adult dragons who had been flying through it. The mother of the 2 cubs had been separated from them during the worst of the storm. She had searched for days afterward, flying in wide circles over the mountains, calling for them, but she found nothing. The cubs were gone. Word reached the Emperor's court within a week. Commander Rundax was the one who brought the report. Rune was a dragon officer, tall, broad, with dark blue scales and sharp, intelligent eyes. He was one of the most respected commanders in the Empire. He was not someone who brought bad news lightly, and he was not someone who exaggerated. When he stood before Emperor Kalen and told him that 2 cubs had vanished near the human colony, the Emperor listened without interrupting. When Rune finished, the Emperor was quiet for a long time. Then he gave his orders. A search was to begin. It was to be thorough, and it was to be handled carefully, because the cubs had disappeared near human territory, and the Empire did not want trouble with the humans. Not over this. Not yet. On the other side of Valdris. 9. In a small outpost near the border between the colony lands and the dragon territory, a woman named Sarah Voss was doing her job. Sarah was 32 years old. She was not tall, but she carried herself in a way that made people pay attention when she spoke. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple knot and calm, steady eyes that missed very little. She had been a human diplomat for 6 years, and for the last 2 of those years she had been assigned to the Dragon Empire's border region. Her job was to keep the peace between humans and dragons. It was not an easy job. There were old tensions between the 2 species. Not hatred exactly, but a deep and quiet distrust that had built up over generations. Sarah's role was to make sure that distrust did not turn into something worse. She first heard about Frank and the cubs through a trader who passed through the outpost on his way to Cedar Falls. The trader had heard the rumors. Whispered talk in the town about the old electrician and the strange creatures he was hiding in his cabin. The trader did not think much of it. He assumed it was just a local story, probably exaggerated. But Sarah listened carefully, and something in the back of her mind told her it was important. She sent a quiet message up through the diplomatic channels. She did not raise alarms. She simply reported what she had heard and asked for guidance. It was the kind of careful, measured move that had made her one of the best diplomats in the region. The message reached the Emperor's court within 2 days. When Commander Rundax read the report, he understood immediately what it meant. The missing cubs, the human colony, the old man with the strange creatures in his cabin. It all connected. He brought the information to Emperor Kalen without delay. The Emperor listened. Then he made a decision. Rundax would go to Valdris, 9 himself. He would find the cubs. He would find the human, and he would bring them both back. Rune arrived on Valdrise, 9 on a gray morning, landing his small ship on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. He did not come alone. 2 other dragon officers accompanied him, but he told them to stay back. He wanted to see the situation for himself before anything else happened. He found Frank's cabin easily enough. It was a small place, sitting quietly at the edge of town near the base of the mountains. Smoke was rising from the chimney, the yard was muddy from the recent storms, and sitting on the porch watching him approach with calm, bright eyes were 2 small dragons. Rune stopped. He stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment, studying the cubs. He could see that they were healthy now. Their scales were smooth, their movements were steady, and they looked well fed. They did not look frightened. They did not look confused. They looked comfortable. They looked like they belonged there. That surprised him more than anything else. The door of the cabin opened and Frank Cole stepped out. He was a broad, quiet man with gray hair and steady hands. He looked at Rune without fear. He did not run. He did not try to hide the cubs or make excuses. He simply stood on his porch and looked at the dragon commander the way a man looks at someone he has been expecting. Rune studied Frank for a moment. Then he looked back at the cubs. Ember had stood up and walked down the porch steps. They walked right past Rune, close enough to brush against his leg, and then turned back toward Frank as if checking to make sure the old man was still there. Cinder did not move from the porch, but it watched Rune with quiet, trusting eyes. Not afraid, not hostile, simply calm. Rune had seen many things in his long career. He had seen dragons fight. He had seen diplomats argue. He had seen wars nearly break out over small mistakes. But he had never seen anything quite like this. 2 dragon cubs, sitting openly beside a human, showing no sign of fear or distress, and the human standing there with no weapon and no excuse, looking at them the way a father looks at his children. Rune did not take the cubs. Not that day. He stayed for almost an hour. He watched the way Frank moved around them. He watched the way the cubs followed Frank, stayed close to him, pressed against him when they rested. He watched the way Frank fed them. Quietly, carefully, without rush. He saw the small medical wraps that had been used on their wounds, now mostly healed. He saw the blanket near the wood stove where they slept at night. When he left, he said very little to Frank. He simply nodded once and walked back toward his ship, but when he sat down to write his report to Emperor Kalen, he spent a long time choosing his words. He had to be honest. That was the most important thing. He had to tell the Emperor exactly what he had seen, not just the facts, but the feeling behind them, the trust, the bond, the strange and quiet way the two dragon cubs had chosen a human electrician as their own. It was not the kind of report that was easy to write, and it was not the kind of report that would be easy for the Emperor to read. But Rundax wrote it anyway, because he knew that what he had seen in that small cabin on the edge of Cedar Falls was important, more important than he fully understood yet. He sent the report that night, and then he waited. The whole galaxy was about to pay attention. Within days of Commander Rundax sending his report, word had reached almost every corner of the galaxy. A human had taken two dragon cubs. A human had raised them. A human had kept them hidden in a small cabin on the edge of a colony town, and the cubs had not only survived, they had thrived. They had bonded with him. They had chosen him. People did not know what to think. Some were afraid. Some were angry. Some thought the old man had made a terrible mistake and that the Dragon Empire would punish him for it. News stations across dozens of planets ran the story over and over. Diplomats argued behind closed doors. Leaders of human colonies sent quiet messages to each other, worried about what this could mean for the relationship between humans and dragons. And in the heart of the Dragon Empire, Emperor Kalen read Commander Rundax's report 3 times. He did not rush his decision. He was not a ruler who made choices based on emotion or on what others expected him to do. He thought carefully. He listened to his advisors. And he took his time. But first he wanted to see the human for himself. The order came through official channels. Frank Cole was to be brought to the Dragon Empire's homeworld. He was not under arrest. Not exactly. But he was expected to appear before the Emperor and explain himself. The message was polite, but it was clear. This was not a request. Frank received the message on a Tuesday morning. Linda Marsh was sitting at his table when he read it. Gary Owens was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, listening. Neither of them said anything for a long time after Frank finished reading. Then Gary said, "Do you want me to find you a lawyer?" Frank shook his head. He folded the message carefully and set it on the table. Then he looked toward the stove, where Ember and Cinder were curled up together, half asleep in the warmth. Ember opened one gold eye and looked at Frank. Cinder stirred slightly and pressed closer to Ember's side. "No," Frank said quietly. "I will tell them the truth. That is all I have." He left Cedar Falls 2 days later. The cubs went with him. That was the one condition he had set when he agreed to go. He would not leave them behind. The Empire had agreed to this, though no one explained why. Perhaps they wanted to see the cubs up close. Perhaps they wanted to see how Frank and the cubs acted around each other in a formal setting. Perhaps they simply understood that separating them would not go well for anyone. The journey took 3 days by ship. Frank sat quietly in the small cabin they gave him, and Ember and Cinder stayed close to him the entire time. They did not seem frightened by the ship or by the strangers around them. They seemed to sense that Frank was calm, and so they stayed calm too. When they arrived on the Dragon Empire's homeworld, the place took Frank's breath away. It was a vast and ancient world, all dark stone and deep green forests and rivers that ran like silver through the valleys. The sky was wider here, somehow, and the air smelled different, older. Heavier. The city where the Emperor lived was built into the side of a great mountain, with towers and halls carved directly into the rock. It was not a place that was built for humans. Everything was bigger than it needed to be for a man like Frank. The doorways were tall, the ceilings were high. The halls echoed with every step. A legal advisor named Judge Mara Eldon was waiting for him when he arrived. Mara was 58 years old, with silver hair and calm, careful eyes. She had spent her entire career working in diplomacy between humans and dragons, and she was one of the few humans that the Dragon Empire trusted completely. She greeted Frank politely and explained what would happen. He would appear before Emperor Kalen in the Great Hearing Chamber. He would be allowed to speak. He would not be harmed. But the Emperor would decide what happened next, to Frank and to the cubs. Frank nodded. He understood. The hearing took place the next morning. The chamber was enormous. The ceiling stretched so high above that Frank could barely see it. The walls were made of dark stone, smooth and old, and they were covered in carvings that told the history of the Dragon Empire going back thousands of years. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform of black rock, sat Emperor Kalen. He was larger than Frank had imagined. His golden scales caught the light from the tall windows and seemed to glow from within. His eyes were ancient and sharp, and they fixed on Frank the moment he entered the room. There was no anger in those eyes, but there was weight, the weight of a ruler who had seen everything and who would not be fooled by anything. Behind the Emperor stood an elder dragon named Alara. She was old, very old, and her scales were a faded silver white. She watched the proceedings without speaking, her expression unreadable. Frank walked to the center of the chamber. Ember and Cinder walked beside him, one on each side. The cubs did not hesitate. They did not look around at the grand room or the dragons watching them. They simply stayed close to Frank, pressing gently against his legs as they walked. The chamber was silent. Emperor Kalen looked at the cubs for a long time. Then he looked at Frank. "You took 2 of my people," the Emperor said. His voice was deep and steady, and it filled the chamber without effort. "Tell me why." Frank did not bow. He did not beg, he did not make excuses. He stood straight, the way the military had taught him to stand, and he spoke clearly. He told them everything. He told them about the storm, about finding the cubs in the ravine, hurt and alone, and crying. He told them about carrying them up the rocks and back to his cabin. He told them about the nights he spent trying to figure out how to feed them, about the cuts he had cleaned and the lead he had wrapped, about the way they had slowly learned to trust him, and the way he had slowly learned to understand them. He did not say he had done it for glory. He did not say he had done it for reward. He simply said what was true. "I found 2 small creatures that were hurt and alone," Frank said, "and I helped them. That is all I did. I helped them because it was the right thing to do." The chamber stayed silent. No one moved. Emperor Kalen watched Frank for a long moment. Then he looked down at the cubs. Ember had moved slightly forward and was now standing right in front of the Emperor's platform. It looked up at Kalen with its bright gold eyes, calm, open, unafraid. Cinder had not moved from Frank's side, but it turned its head and looked at the Emperor too, with the same quiet trust. Kalen studied them. Then he looked at Alara. The old elder dragon was watching the cubs with an expression that was hard to read. After a moment, she stepped forward and spoke for the first time. "The bond is real," Alara said. Her voice was soft but carried through the chamber like a clear bell. "These cubs have chosen him. That is not something that can be faked. It is not something that can be forced. It is rare, and it is real." The chamber fell silent again. Emperor Kalen turned his gaze back to Frank. The old electrician stood where he was, steady and still, waiting. He did not look afraid. He did not look hopeful. He simply looked like a man who had done what he believed was right and was prepared to accept whatever came next. The Emperor was quiet for a very long time. Then he spoke. "Frank Cole," Kalen said, "you did not take my people out of greed. You did not take them out of malice. You took them because you saw 2 creatures in pain, and you chose to help them. That is not a crime. That is something rare." He paused. The whole chamber held its breath.
"I will not punish you," the Emperor said.
A murmur rippled through the dragons gathered in the room. Some shifted. Some exchanged looks. But no one spoke. Kalen was not finished. "I will honor you," he said. The silence that followed was the deepest Frank Cole had ever heard. Emperor Kalen had said them clearly, and everyone in the chamber had heard them. But for a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was heavy and complete, the kind of silence that fills a room when something unexpected has just changed the shape of the world. Frank Cole stood in the center of the great chamber, his hands at his sides, his face calm. He did not fully understand what was happening yet. He knew the Emperor had said he would not be punished. He knew the Emperor had said something else after that, something about honor. But the full weight of those words had not yet settled into him. So he was not a man who reacted quickly to things. He was a man who listened and thought and understood things in his own time. Ember and Cinder were still at his feet. Ember had lifted its head and was looking up at the Emperor with bright, curious eyes, as if it could feel the change in the room even if it did not understand the reason for it. Cinder had pressed close to Frank's leg and was very still, watching everything with its deep amber eyes. Emperor Kalen rose from his platform. He was tall, much taller than Frank, and when he moved, the room seemed to shift around him. He descended the steps slowly and walked toward Frank with measured, careful steps. The other dragons in the chamber parted to let him pass. No one breathed. The Emperor stopped directly in front of Frank. He looked down at the old electrician for a long moment. Then he did something that no one in the room expected. He bowed his head. It was not a deep bow. It was not dramatic or theatrical. It was a small, quiet gesture, just a slight lowering of his great golden head. But in the Dragon Empire, that gesture meant something. It meant respect. It meant recognition. It meant that the one who gave it saw something worthy in the one who received it. Frank did not know the full meaning of the gesture at that moment, but he felt it. Something in the way Kalen moved, something in the weight of the moment, told him that this was important. So Frank did what he had always done when someone showed him respect. He nodded back simply and honestly. Then the Emperor spoke again. "From this day forward," Kalen said, and his voice carried through the chamber without effort, "Frank Cole will hold the title of Bridge Bearer. He will be the first human in the history of this empire to carry that name. It is a title given to those who have brought two peoples closer together. It has not been given in over 300 years. The murmur that followed was louder this time. Dragons shifted and looked at each other. Some nodded slowly. Others were clearly surprised. But no one argued. No one challenged the Emperor. His word was final. And beyond that, many of them had seen Commander Ruin Dax's report. They knew what had happened in that small cabin. They knew the Cubs had chosen this human. And they knew that meant something. Sarah Voss was standing near the back of the chamber, watching everything unfold. She had been invited to attend as a diplomatic observer, and she had said yes without hesitation. Now she stood with her arms at her sides, her expression steady, but her eyes were bright. She had spent years trying to build bridges between humans and dragons. She had worked quietly and patiently, sending careful messages, smoothing over small arguments, keeping the peace one day at a time. And now, in a single morning, more had changed between the two species than in all the years she had been working. She did not smile. She was too careful for that, too aware of how fragile the moment was. But she felt something warm and quiet settle in her chest, and she held on to it. The ceremony that followed was simple but meaningful. There were no long speeches. There was no grand display of power or wealth. Kalen simply presented Frank with a small token, a carved piece of dark stone, shaped like two wings spread open. It was old. It looked like it had been made by hand long ago, by someone who had put care and thought into every line. Frank held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment. Then he closed his fingers around it and held it close. After the ceremony, Frank was given a private room to rest. Linda Marsh and Gary Owens had traveled with him from Cedar Falls. The Empire had allowed it, and Frank had quietly asked them to come. Linda sat in a chair near the window, watching the alien sky outside with quiet wonder. Gary sat on the edge of the bed, turning the whole thing over in his mind. "You are the first human in 300 years to get that kind of honor," Gary said, shaking his head slowly. "Do you understand that?" Frank was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, with Ember curled up in his lap and Cinder resting against his side. He looked up at Gary and shrugged slightly. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said. Linda looked at him from her chair and smiled. "No," she said quietly, "not everyone would have." "That is exactly the point." Frank did not have an answer for that. So he said nothing. He simply looked down at the two cubs beside him and let his hand rest gently on Ember's back. The decision about the cubs came the next day. Emperor Kalen sent a message through Commander Rundax, who delivered it personally. The cubs would stay with Frank. That was the Emperor's ruling. They were free to live with the human who had saved them and raised them. The Empire would not take them back. If Frank ever needed help caring for them, the Empire would provide it. And if the cubs ever wished to return to Dragon Society, that door would remain open for them as well. Frank read the message alone, sitting on the porch of the guest quarters, with Ember and Cinder sleeping quietly beside him in the warm afternoon light. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, close to his chest. Nina Ross was the one who told the rest of the galaxy. She was 27 years old, with quick eyes and a voice that people trusted. She had been a journalist for only 4 years, but she had already built a name for herself as someone who told stories honestly and without exaggeration. When the story of Frank Cole and the two dragon cubs reached her, she knew immediately that it was important, not just as news, as something bigger. Something that people needed to hear. She traveled to Valdris, 9, and spent a week in Cedar Falls. She talked to Linda. She talked to Gary. She sat on Frank's porch and watched Ember chase a butterfly through the yard while Cinder dozed in a patch of sunlight. She did not rush. She listened. And when she finally wrote the story and broadcast it across the galaxy, She wrote it the way it had happened, simply and honestly, without adding drama where there was none. The response was immediate and enormous. People everywhere watched Nina's broadcast. They watched the footage of Frank sitting on his porch with 2 small dragons curled beside him. They watched Ember jump up and press its head against Frank's chest. They watched Cinder look up at the camera with calm, trusting eyes. And they felt something shift inside themselves, something quiet but real, like a door opening after being closed for a very long time. For the first time in generations, humans and dragons began to talk to each other. Not through diplomats or official channels, and not through careful messages and formal meetings. Ordinary people began to reach out. Students on human worlds asked to learn about dragon history. Young dragons on empire worlds expressed curiosity about human culture. Trade between the 2 species, which had been slow and cautious for decades, began to grow. Small steps, quiet ones, but real. Frank Cole did not see most of it happen. He was not a man who followed the news or paid attention to what the galaxy was saying about him. He did not care about fame or recognition. The carved stone token from Emperor Kalen sat on the small shelf in his cabin, next to a photograph of his sister Dana and a cup he used for pencils. He looked at it sometimes, when the morning light hit it in just the right way, and he thought about the old emperor and the quiet nod they had shared in that great chamber. But mostly, Frank went back to his life. He fixed power lines when storms knocked him down. He caught fish in the stream behind his cabin. He sat on his porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down over the mountains, and every evening, without fail, Ember and Cinder were beside him. Ember had grown bigger now, big enough to sit beside Frank on the porch without looking small. Its red scales caught the last light of the day and glowed like warm coals. Cinder sat on Frank's other side, quiet and calm as always, its dark scales flickering with soft orange in the fading light. Sometimes one of them would lean against Frank's shoulder. Sometimes the other would rest its head on his knee, and Frank would sit there, saying nothing, watching the stars begin to appear one by one in the wide sky above Cedar Falls. He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not think of himself as a bridge between 2 civilizations. He was just an old electrician who had found 2 hurt cubs in a ravine and had done what felt right. But the galaxy remembered, and for a long time after that quiet evening on the porch, people across 100 worlds would tell the story of the veteran who rescued 2 dragons, and how the Emperor's decision changed everything. Frank Cole looked up at the stars, felt the warmth of Ember and Cinder beside him, and said nothing at all. He simply stayed,